If you didn't know, there is a single boss raid releasing inside this season with 12.0.7, which will be in about 3 weeks. Blizzard did some experimenting with the loot on this boss. It originally started as Warbound Myth Track drops, then they changed it to 298 eye level random stat drops, and this week they changed it again to 298 fixed stat drops. There is a nice haste mastery cantrip ring, there is a crit mastery cantrip neck, there is a trinket, not sure how good it is, and each armor type has 2 specific drops. These are all 298 eye level items from Mythic, meaning they are hard BIS as long as the stats or the respective catalyst stats are good. Now you might have noticed something with the stat distribution on these items. There is not a single point of versatility. The reason for this is kind of obvious, there are not many specs that want verse, but it is kind of rough for the specs who do want verse when all the gear is tailored to not have it. Here is a reload tweet I saw where he brings up the issue, and here is another tweet from him a bit before it where he scrapes the entire loot table and finds out there is half as much verse as there is other stats. So I did some more research into what stats classes actually wanted, and what is funny about this is that it is actually a generous amount of verse in the loot table. I went through every spec in the game to find their BIS stats. For DPS, I simply use the optimal BIS sim profile. For tanks and healers, I use the current rank 1 Lura log. And in total, there are 2 specs with versatility in their top 2 stats, Brewmaster and Resto Shaman. The only DPS with verse as their 3rd stat is Outlaw, and there are only 3 DPS specs that run more than 200 verse. Resto Shaman is the only healer that wants verse in raid. And every tank actually does want a little bit of verse. I do concede that this is not an accurate methodology for tanks. If you look at Andy's Guardian Druid, who is rank 1 in every key right now, he is running 900 verse in dungeons. So my point is that versatility has been reduced to a defensive stat for tanks only. And looking at the totals, only 5% of stats run by all specs are verse, and a lot of them are just forced from tier pieces or other similar items. Now a question you might have is, why is versatility so bad now? Versatility has always been a fallback stat. Its scaling per point is always less than the other 3 stats. This is most likely due to the damage reduction aspect of it. It is definitely very strong if a spec stacks verse and just gets a 10% or more DR for free. But that didn't stop verse from being the BIS stat for many specs in the past. What's changed is that over the years, specs have been given better scaling. Outlaw Rogue used to be the prime verse stacker. Every other stat was bad, but now they have crit scaling and a required haste breakpoint. Sub Rogue used to be a verse mastery spec. Now they have a haste breakpoint. Back in Amirdrasil, I was playing Ret and verse was my highest stat. They ended up buffing the mastery by a lot and now you don't play verse. Back in the Bonedust era, Windwalker only wanted crit verse, but they gave it some haste scaling just like every other energy spec, and now it's a haste mastery spec. Even last tier, Ellie was a very good raid spec stacking verse mastery. They ended up making Lava Burst scale with crit and now Ellie does not use verse. Also, pretty much every DPS is now using Eyes of the Eagle crit damage ring enchant, which means every spec is doing 4% more crit damage. So nothing actually changed about verse, it's just that every other stat has gotten better. And it's also not just design related. We are currently not hitting the diminishing returns on stats. The current stat budget is approximately 2.6k total secondaries on a BIS character. Diminishing returns for stats currently start at 1.3k of a stat, meaning to hit a diminishing return you need to invest over half of your total stat budget into a single stat, which is generally pretty unrealistic. This is quite normal for the first batch of the expansion. I looked back at my gear in Season 1 War Within and it was the same, but back then there were more specs that had bad stat scaling, so verse was more commonly used. But I'm trying to make the opposite point here. I actually think this is good and I do not like diminishing returns. Blizzard added diminishing returns to secondary stats going into Shadowlands. The theory behind why is that they saw the immense stat stacking with corruption and wanted to have a failsafe. However, I think this diminishing return system has completely backfired and made stats less interesting. Currently, if I get an item for my Ellie Shaman that is crit mastery, I know it is good. I don't have to sim, I can just equip it, it feels good getting a BIS statted item. But in Season 2 and 3 of an expansion, you get to a point where stats on an item do not really matter. You reach the stat DR almost passively in those seasons with just like 1 ring and 1 neck, and then end up putting on whatever items you have beyond that. Like here is my gear at the end of Season 3 War Within. I am playing Farseer Ellie, which was a verse mastery spec that didn't like crit or haste beyond a point. But that didn't matter, and I actually equipped a full crit haste ring and a crit haste shield over the verse mastery shield that I also had, just because my mastery had hit the diminishing return point. Now my opinion here is that it's kind of poor design that a worse statted item is somehow better than the BIS statted item. Potentially it could be a trap for inexperienced players who just look at stat priorities in a guide and then go for those items. It also just increases reliance on sims. But But I think this tier is probably the least I have needed sims in a long time. Most of my characters, I just go for islands with good stats and it turns out they are the best. I like not having diminishing returns to worry about. Also, I don't know what diminishing returns even solved. They didn't add any massive stat scalers like corruption since they implemented the diminishing returns, so in my opinion, the diminishing return system as a whole is a needless overcomplication that is also not displayed in the base UI without an add-on. So this was all a bit of a tangent. We were talking about versatility in the season's loot tables. And it's obvious if you look through the loot tables that Blizzard knows versatility is undesirable. Out of 75 items, only 17 of them have verse at all, and only 5 of them have majority verse. There are 2 boots of aversion, 1 helmet of Salhadar, and then there are the 2 shields that drop this tier. Notice anything about these shields? They are actually the same shield. Same icon, same stats. Only difference is that the Aversion shield has 1 more crit and 1 less verse than the Baloran shield. Now I don't really know how the loot tables are decided, but surely this is an oversight. Maybe it's an oversight because the loot tables are potentially developed independently of each other. For many seasons now, we have had an issue with the impact of returning dungeons on M+ loot tables. These are the necks in the pool for the current season. We have Haste vs Neck 1, Haste vs Neck 2, and Crit Haste Neck. Not many options. Also, if you don't like Haste, there are no options. Every single neck this season from M+, Raid, or the PvP thing, they all have haste on them. And this is actually not the first time we've had an issue with necks. I remember in War Within Season 2, there were only 2 necks on the dungeon loot table. It was Cinderbrew and it was Darkflame Clef. In Season 3, they actually had to go back in and add a neck drop to Priori and Floodgate. And speaking of War Within Season 2, that is a season that famously had very bad dungeon trinkets. They were so bad that it spawned an army of single-issue voters for the Season 3 dungeon vote, where the 4 winning dungeons had trinkets. And we are in the same position again. Some of the dungeon trinkets are embarrassingly bad. Look at Never Melting Ice Crystal. It is a 3-minute trinket. But that's fine, not every trinket has to line up. It could be interesting if it's high budget. Well, it isn't. And it also has a downside, and they forgot to add an ICD to it. Look at what happens when I press it with my Ascendance. Here is the 1 single frame where I have the buff. Here is a log where I'm using it on my undergeared Shadow Priest. I get 2 uses and it has a 0.6% uptime. The stacks just disappear instantly. This trinket is literally useless. Like, I think it's fine for some trinkets to be weak, not everything has to be BIS, but how is there no sanity check on something like this? If they bring a trinket back, they at least should make sure that it works. Also, the never melting part of the name is very ironic here. So back to the topic of versatility. I've spoken about the verse you get from gear, but what about the sources of verse outside of gear? Because every DPS is running close to 0 verse, any amount of verse gained from an external buff is mathematically full effectiveness. Mark of the Wild is the elephant in the room. This raid buff is currently at its full strength. It is a flat 3% damage and 1.5% DR. I cannot put into words how broken Mark of the Wild is. Most raid buffs are approximately 2% damage. I did this research a year ago. I think assuming a standard comp with a third of DPS being melee, you end up with these numbers for raid buffs. Meaning that Mark of the Wild is not only tied for being the best raid buff for damage, but on top of that, it provides half the DR of the DR buffs. On some bosses, a Trophic doesn't even work, and Mark of the Wild is stronger defensively than having a Rogue. And that doesn't even scratch what Druid has been doing to M+. Every single season since they introduced Mark of the Wild, a Druid spec has been present in the #1 run in every key. The benefit from Mark of the Wild is so strong that all 4 Druid specs have to be trash for Druid to not be meta. Now, raid buffs are their own debate, but I really think Mark of the Wild should at least be reduced to 2% to be on par with Sky Fury. Now, the second external source of verse is a Vantus Rune. Previously, Vantus Runes gave 3% verse. In Midnight, Vantus Runes were buffed to give 5% verse. Now, I don't really know why they buffed it that much. Vantus is absolutely crazy now, gaining not only 5% raid DPS, but also 2.5% raid DR. It's pretty much enough that you can just pop Vantus to brute force a boss. For reference, 5% damage is roughly equivalent to 5 item levels. If you look at our first week of Prog and Baloran, we were 277 item level average with full Vantus, meaning we actually would have had higher raid DPS than Liquid did on the same week. The Vantus diff is actually so crazy that Gingy had 2 mages to Vantus each boss. So why could this necessarily be bad? Well, Blizzard kinda needs to tune the later bosses around Vantus, because if they don't, then the bosses become too easy with this 5% Vantus. Now, during Prog, I keep tabs on my rivals, and Pop-Tart Corndog used almost full Vantus on Lightblind and Vanguard week 1. Which is fine, it was a hard boss. This is actually a strategy that was promoted by Max, and they were probably not killing Crown in that week because of time constraints. But the next day, they walked into Crown of the Cosmos and wiped in Phase 1 50 times. Now, Crown of the Cosmos Phase 1 is a damage check. If you can get Demiar to 0 before the second arrow, the phase becomes monumentally easier because otherwise you need to kill off Demiar with a massive damage reduction, and the 5% from Vantus really helped us out there. Now Vantus might have not been the only factor here, but I do think this illustrates the potential issue of a soft lock that you could put yourself in with misuse of Vantus. So how does this tie into versatility? Well, Vantus is 5% verse, and Mark of the Wild is 3% verse. That means on a hard boss, you are getting 8% verse for free. Now by law of mathematics, this makes other sources of verse worse. Say you were to get 10% haste on your gear, well, you're going from 0 to 10%, so it's a 10% increase. But if you get 10% verse on your gear while having these two buffs, then that verse is mathematically 7% less efficient per point. So not only is verse already the least efficient stat, but the large amounts of free verse that you get make it even worse. I have talked about a lot of different things in this video that may or may not have been related to versatility. I honestly just had a lot of opinions that I wanted to get out. Versatility itself is a tough subject, it is not an interesting stat, a lot of people don't like it. I don't really play PvP anymore, so I don't know the opinions there, but I kinda wish I could play PvP without farming a verse set. I do think secondary stats are maybe a bit stale right now. It's been 10 years since we were given these 4 secondaries and they've stayed mostly the same since. Maybe in a future expansion there could be a shake-up. But thanks for watching, it's been a while since I released opinion videos. I plan to release another video next week about another certain system that has gotten stale.